May 30th, 1964. The Indianapolis 500 explodes in fire. 2 drivers are dead. And the revolutionary engine that promised to change racing forever, Ford's 649B, stands accused. But this isn't a story about failure. It's about how a Scottish sheep farmer, a renegade Detroit engineer, and a British madman built an engine so advanced it terrified America, and then conquered it. The mighty front-engine roadsters, symbols of American dominance, are suddenly obsolete. Behind this shift, Ford Motor Company. But this wasn't just horsepower, it was a revolution. European finesse, corporate ambition, and a war on convention collided at 180 miles per hour. What followed was more than a race. It was the moment Indy's soul was ripped wide open. A new challenger at Indy, Colin Chapman's Lotus 29. Its secret weapon? A modified Ford Fairlane pushrod 289. Clark wasn't just fast, he was a savant. By 1963, he'd already dominated Formula One with 7 Grand Prix wins. His mechanic, Cedric Selzer, called him a man who drove with his fingertips, feeling piston rings wear out. Clark stalked Parnelli Jones's oil-spewing roadster for 200 laps. He lost by 33 seconds. But the message was sent. The Offenhauser dynasty was crumbling. Ford's VP, Leo Beebe, issued a decree. Build an engine that humiliates them. At the heart of this incursion was the 649B, a revolutionary masterstroke of engineering built by Colin Chapman. Born in the rolling hills of Fife, Scotland, Clark rose from modest beginnings on his family's sheep farm to become one of the most naturally gifted drivers the world has ever seen. By the time he arrived at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 1963, he was already making headlines in Europe. His performances in Formula One with Team Lotus had stunned the racing elite. Smooth, precise, and seemingly effortless, Clark had an uncanny ability to find the edge of grip without overstepping it. But beneath his calm demeanor was a fierce competitor, a driver who didn't just rely on talent, but understood machinery on an almost instinctive level. He had already clinched his first Formula One Grand Prix win in 1962 and was on a meteoric rise, becoming known for his mastery in both dry and wet conditions. His mechanical sympathy made him a favorite among engineers, especially Lotus founder Colin Chapman, who trusted Clark implicitly to push new designs to their limit. It was no coincidence that Clark was chosen to pilot Ford's radical new Indy effort. He wasn't just fast, he was intelligent, adaptable, and unshaken by unfamiliar territory. Overall, he was exactly the kind of driver you wanted when taking on the might of Indianapolis with a car and engine that defied convention. The car was underpowered compared to the dominant Offenhauser engines, and unlike most of the field, it ran on pump gasoline instead of methanol. But what the Lotus Ford lacked in raw grunt, it made up for in aerodynamics, chassis balance, and efficiency. By lap 100, the racing establishment began to realize that this odd-looking mid-engine car wasn't just a gimmick, it was a threat. As the laps wound down, Clark was in hot pursuit of Parnelli Jones, who led the race in a traditional front-engine Watson Roadster. But Jones was leaking oil, a condition that under modern rules would have led to a black flag. Despite Clark's relentless pace and the Lotus's ability to corner faster and consume less fuel, the Ford-powered Lotus could not close the gap before the checkered flag. Jones took the win, but Ford and Lotus had made their mark. They hadn't won, but they'd shaken the establishment. And more importantly, they had exposed cracks in the Offenhauser empire. The message from Ford was loud and clear. They weren't content to be mere participants in American motorsport. They were here to change the game, the pushrod engine's final stand. The Fairlane engine that nearly rewrote Indy history in 1963 was a testament to what could be achieved through intelligent design and driver skill. Originally, a 260 cubic inch small block, it was massaged into producing 375 horsepower. Not groundbreaking by Indy standards, but impressive considering it ran on gasoline and had to carry the car through 500 miles of intense racing. The engine was compact, reliable, and well-matched to the lightweight Lotus chassis. But there was a ceiling to what could be extracted from a pushrod architecture. The engine's airflow was limited by its two-valve layout, and despite the use of high-quality components and aggressive cam timing, its red line sat far below what was needed to truly challenge the methanol-fueled Offenhauser. Ford engineers, led by brilliant minds like Bill Gay and Phil Remington, understood this reality. The 1963 performance had been inspiring, but it was also a wake-up call. If they wanted to win Indy outright, not just compete, they would need an entirely new engine, something unlike anything the American racing world had seen before. The pushrod engine had served its purpose. Now it was time for something more radical. Birth of the DOHC Indy V8. In late 1963, Ford greenlit the development of a new power plant, one that would abandon the pushrod legacy entirely and embrace a more advanced approach. Bill Gay, a key figure in Ford's racing division, was tasked with leading this effort alongside the legendary Phil Remington, who had recently worked with Carroll Shelby on the Cobra project. Together, they began designing an engine from scratch, not a warmed-over production unit, but a clean-sheet design meant solely for racing. The foundation of this new engine was loosely based on the 221 cubic inch Fairlane block, but almost every major component was reimagined. Most significantly, the design incorporated dual overhead camshafts and 4 valves per cylinder, a configuration that allowed for better airflow, higher RPMs, and more precise control over combustion timing. These were technologies common in European racing, but nearly unheard of in American V8s at the time. The engine was dubbed the Ford Indy 649B, with 649 signifying the racing program's internal designation and B indicating its revision level. Displacing 255 cubic inches, the engine was deliberately undersized to take advantage of Indy's weight and displacement rules. It could rev higher, breathe deeper, and, thanks to new materials and machining techniques, run more efficiently at the edge of mechanical limits. One of the engine's most unusual design features was the vertical stacking of the camshafts. The exhaust camshaft was positioned above the intake camshaft in each cylinder head. This allowed for a straighter shot into the combustion chamber and a more compact valve arrangement. The combustion chambers themselves were shaped using electrical discharge machining, an aerospace-level manufacturing process that allowed for surgical levels of precision. The benefits were clear: better airflow symmetry, improved combustion efficiency, and reduced detonation risk. By the time it was ready for testing, the new DOHC V8 was producing over 425 horsepower at 8,000 RPM, an astonishing figure for an engine of that size, especially one built in such a short time frame. Ford had moved from pushrod to precision, from brute force to calculated dominance. But the transition wouldn't be easy. Technological marvel with a steep learning curve. With the 649B engine, Ford had built more than just a racing motor. They had built a technological statement. The engine was compact, efficient, and light years ahead of the competition in terms of theoretical performance. But as with all cutting-edge designs, the early days were filled with growing pains. The engine's complexity introduced a host of new problems. The 4 valve heads required exacting timing and valve train geometry. The tight tolerances that allowed for high RPM operation also made the engine vulnerable to heat soak, oiling issues, and minor assembly errors. And with so many moving parts, 2 cams per head, 32 valves total, narrow rocker arms, tiny valve springs, the margin for error was razor thin. The engineers knew they were dealing with a delicate balance of power and fragility. Everything from oil return paths to breather pressures had to be carefully managed. It wasn't enough to design a fast engine. It had to be durable, able to withstand 200 laps of full throttle abuse at one of the most punishing circuits in the world. Still, the potential was undeniable. In tests, the engine screamed with a ferocity unheard of in American racing. It revved like a European sports car, accelerated like a jet turbine, and sounded like something from the future. It was a machine built for victory, but one that demanded surgical precision to survive. The 1964 Indianapolis 500 would be its first true test: lubrication woes and engineering complexity. The leap to a dual overhead camshaft V8 engine wasn't just a shift in architecture. It was a complete reinvention of what Ford had ever attempted. With 4 camshafts, 32 valves, and exotic materials being machined to near aerospace tolerances, the 649B was unlike anything that had ever sat in a Ford bay, let alone one bound for Indy at 200 miles per hour. But with innovation comes risk, and as engineers would soon learn, the new engine harbored internal struggles as fierce as the on-track battles it was built for. One of the most immediate challenges arose from the engine's oiling system. At such high operating speeds and temperatures, lubrication had to be not only sufficient, but surgically precise. The DOHC configuration placed tremendous demands on the oiling circuit. Cam lobes rotating at blistering speed, small oil passages buried deep inside the complex cylinder heads, and a tall, narrow valve train profile meant even slight oil starvation could lead to catastrophic failure. Early dyno runs showed accelerated wear on cam followers, scoring on lobes, and pressure drop-offs at redline. Engineers quickly realized that what worked in conventional V8s wouldn't cut it in this new, high-revving realm. To make things worse, oil returning from the top end would cascade rapidly down into the sump. But the speed and violence of this flow created another problem: aeration. As oil mixed with air, it began to foam, compromising pressure and flow stability. Foamy oil doesn't lubricate well. It compresses and expands unpredictably, leading to hydraulic issues in bearing clearances and lifters. The longer the engine ran at race pace, the worse the aeration problem became, particularly under hard cornering when G-forces sloshed oil unpredictably inside the crankcase. Then there was windage, a deceptively simple but highly detrimental effect caused by the rotating crankshaft throwing oil mist around the crankcase. In a high-speed DOHC engine, windage produced back pressure that not only robbed horsepower but pushed oil vapor into the breather system. This blow-by led to further oil loss, pressure fluctuations, and in some cases, oil making its way into the combustion chamber, fouling spark plugs and increasing emissions. Large bearing clearances, intended to reduce internal friction and allow faster assembly, actually worsened the issue. They caused oil to be flung more violently from the crank journals, feeding the windage problem and stressing the breather system even further. These problems weren't just annoying, they were race-ending, and in a 500-mile endurance race, they could cost more than just a win. Ford's overhaul, a layered solution. Ford's racing engineers knew they couldn't patch the problem. They had to completely redesign the engine's oil management system from the ground up. What followed was a masterclass in motorsport problem-solving. First, they tackled the pressure side of the system. The oil pump, already beefier than anything in Ford's production lineup, was re-engineered with a 20% larger delivery gear, increasing flow volume significantly. But pumping more oil was only part of the equation. What mattered more was how fast oil could return to the sump to be recirculated. So Ford introduced twin scavenging pumps, an approach borrowed from endurance racing and aircraft engines. These pumps worked in tandem. One drew oil from the heads and upper galleries, while the other focused on the crankcase. This two-pronged system doubled the return flow capacity, helping ensure that oil didn't pool in unwanted areas like the timing cover or valve covers. Pickup pipes were widened by over 50%, allowing for rapid drainage and less resistance. This also had the side effect of reducing temperature buildup in trapped oil, improving overall thermal control. A second independent scavenge pump was added not just as a backup, but to create separation between clean oil return and potentially contaminated flow. This minimized the risk of recirculating foamy or fuel-diluted oil, another issue when running methanol or gas in a high-compression setup. By isolating the flows, the lubrication system could stay consistent even under punishing G-forces and heat cycling. On the breather side, Ford engineers reimagined the oil tank ventilation layout. They built multiple vent paths to separate oil vapor from crankcase gas, added oil-air separators, and designed a baffled expansion chamber to allow vapor to condense back into liquid and return to the system. This helped neutralize pressure spikes in the crankcase and eliminated the dreaded oil fountain effect seen in earlier tests when blow-by overpressurized the system. Inside the engine, windage trays and directional baffles were placed in the oil pan and around the timing gears. These prevented excess oil from climbing into the rotating assemblies, reducing drag and preventing power loss. A redesigned sump geometry included built-in deflectors that pushed splashed oil toward the pickup under high lateral loads. On the dyno and in practice, these updates dramatically reduced oil pressure fluctuations, turning a liability into a strength. The final system, ready just in time for the '64 Indy 500, was a marvel of racing-specific engineering. Twin scavenge pumps, larger galleries, dual pickup configurations, and high-pressure venting combined to deliver consistent lubrication at 8,000-plus RPM over hundreds of miles. It was a system that would become a template for many future high-performance engines, both in racing and road applications. 1964. Indy, tragedy and regulatory repercussions. But just as Ford engineers celebrated their solution to the oiling crisis, tragedy struck in the most public and painful way possible. On lap 2 of the 1964 Indianapolis 500, driver Dave McDonald lost control of his car, one of Mickey Thompson's radical low-profile Fords, exiting turn 4. He veered into the inside wall, was struck by Eddie Sachs, and both cars erupted into a towering inferno. The crash was swift, violent, and fatal. The root cause was hotly debated. Some blamed McDonald's inexperience with the car's loose rear-end behavior. Others pointed to the car's lightweight frame, rear-heavy balance, or unpredictable handling under full tanks. But the investigation zeroed in on the fuel system, specifically the use of gasoline rather than methanol, and the poor containment of the fuel cells. The ruptured tanks leaked fuel instantly upon impact, and gasoline's fast-burning properties created a fireball too fierce to escape. The irony was bitter. While the DOHC engine had overcome its mechanical weaknesses, the fuel system it relied on proved fatal in the worst way. While it was never confirmed that Ford's engine design directly caused the crash, the association was unavoidable, especially as Ford-powered cars were central to the new wave of rear-engine revolutionaries. In the wake of the accident, the U.S. Auto Club moved quickly to enforce new safety regulations. For 1965, gasoline was banned entirely from the Indy 500. Only methanol, a fuel that burns cooler and is less explosive on impact, would be allowed. This was a massive change, not only for safety but for engine builders. Methanol behaves differently than gasoline. It has a higher latent heat of vaporization, requiring different tuning, carburation or injection, and combustion mapping. For Ford, it meant redesigning aspects of the 649B's fuel delivery system just 1 year after launching the platform. But perhaps more importantly, the accident spurred a greater awareness of motorsport's inherent dangers. It shifted the conversation from speed to survivability and forced engineers to look not just at what made engines fast, but what made them safe. Ford's combustion chamber design, piston cooling oil jets, and even thermal shielding had to be revisited in this new context. Suddenly, being the fastest wasn't enough. You had to survive the distance, and safety became just as integral to innovation as horsepower. Even though Ford did not cause the crash directly, the perception of damage was real. To many in the public and media, Ford's exotic high-speed weapon was part of a fatal chain of engineering ambition unchecked by safety planning. The team returned to Detroit with more than just race data. They carried the weight of a tragedy that would forever shape their motorsport legacy. The 1965 Ford's redemption. The fire of 1964 left a scar on the Indianapolis 500, but Ford didn't flinch. The company returned the next year not with hesitation, but with a vengeance. The 649B had been revised, strengthened, and adapted to run on methanol as mandated by USAC's post-tragedy safety regulations. In place of experimental chassis and aggressive fuel strategies, Ford came back with clarity of purpose, and a new driver determined to prove what their engine could truly do. Jim Clark. Clark, already a Formula One world champion and master of smooth precision, was the perfect match for the refined Ford-powered Lotus 38. The engine, now fully sorted with a robust oiling system and reinforced internal components, was at its peak. Methanol burned cooler and allowed for higher compression ratios. Ford engineers optimized the fuel delivery for methanol's quirks, including its thirst, requiring larger fuel tanks and slightly more conservative tuning for endurance. But reliability was now a core feature, not a question mark. The result was domination. Clark led 190 of the 200 laps in the 1965 Indianapolis 500. He lapped the entire field except for second place. It wasn't just a win, it was a technical rout, and he did it at an average speed of 150.686 miles per hour, a record at the time. Of the 33 cars that started that day, 24 were powered by Ford's DOHC V8. It was a clear signal to the racing world. The 649B wasn't just a bold experiment, it was now the benchmark. More than a year of painful setbacks, redesigns, and even tragedy had culminated in this moment. The 1965 Indy 500 wasn't just a race. It was Ford's redemption story, told in laps and roar. Jim Clark's smooth hands on the wheel, combined with Ford's brute force innovation, turned Detroit's engineering gamble into racing royalty. The engine's second life, turbocharging and evolution. Even after its initial success, the story of the Ford DOHC Indy V8 didn't end. It evolved. As the 1960s wore on and racing regulations changed, forced induction became the next frontier. Engineers began turbocharging the 649B platform, squeezing even more performance out of its already potent layout. By the early 1970s, versions of the engine were producing over 700 horsepower, a staggering number for its time. The addition of turbochargers demanded further reworking. Heat management, valve timing adjustments, compression ratio tweaks, and fuel mapping had to adapt. But the core architecture, dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, strong bottom end, remained largely unchanged. That was the true brilliance of the 649B. It wasn't just fast, it was future-proof. Even after Ford officially pulled back from direct Indy involvement, private teams and independent builders continued to use and win with turbocharged versions of the engine. One of the most iconic victories came in 1977 when racing legend A.J. Foyt won the Indy 500 using a turbocharged version of the original 649 architecture. It was Foyt's 4th win at the Brickyard and a symbolic victory for the engine that had once faced doubts, danger, and fire. By then, the 649B had earned its place in motorsport history, not just as a one-time wonder, but as a reliable, tunable, race-winning platform across more than a decade of evolution. Legacy and cliffhanger. Conclusion. But the influence of the 649B didn't stay confined to American oval tracks. In fact, one of its most significant impacts came not in IndyCar, but in Formula One. British engine builders took close note of Ford's successful DOHC architecture. Among them were the engineers at Cosworth, who were already laying the groundwork for what would become the most legendary Formula One engine of all time, the Cosworth DFV. Its success at Indy may have lit the spark, but the 649B's deeper legacy lies in what it set in motion. The very principles it pioneered, high revving efficiency, advanced valve timing, and modular architecture, would soon redefine how racing engines were designed across the globe. In the hands of Cosworth, those concepts matured into dominance. The DFV went on to power legends, rewrite record books, and influence generations of engineers. Yet behind all that glory was the echo of Detroit's bold experiment. The 649B didn't just change one race, it changed everything. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories. Catch you next time.